He spat on a man who owned every single building on that street. Every one of them. The parking garage he'd just pulled his Bugatti into. The coffee shop where his assistant bought. His $11 oat milk latte. Every morning at exactly 8:15. The 60-story tower with his own name in gold letters bolted to the top of it. All of it, every brick, every deed, every square inch of concrete under his $2,000 shoes, belonged to the man kneeling on the sidewalk in a torn army jacket, quietly gathering the coins that had just been thrown at his feet. Like he was a dog being told to fetch, and in about 11 days, that homeless man was going to own something else too. He was going to own Marcus Wexford's entire life. Stay with me, because this story is not what you think it is. And by the end of it, you're going to understand exactly why some of the richest people you'll ever pass on a sidewalk look like they have absolutely nothing. It was a Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago, the kind of crisp October morning where the wind comes screaming off the lake and cuts right through whatever you're wearing, and the sidewalks outside the Wexford Tower on North Michigan Avenue were packed with the usual river of suits and briefcases and people, staring at their phones instead of where they were walking. Marcus Wexford stepped out of a matte black Bugatti, Chiron that cost more than most people's houses, and he did it the way he did everything, like the world owed him a slow clap just for showing up. 38 years old, tailored charcoal suit, watch worth more than a small apartment, hair combed with the kind of precision that says a stylist comes to your penthouse 3 times a week. He was the CEO of Wexford Capital Holdings, a real estate and private equity empire that, according to the business magazines that loved to put his face on their covers, was worth somewhere north of $4 billion. He'd built luxury towers in Miami, resort complexes in Dubai, and he had just closed the largest single land acquisition in Chicago in over a decade. 40 acres along the river that he planned to turn into what he was already calling, to anyone who would listen, the most exclusive zip code in America. He was not, by any account, a humble man. He gave interviews where he said things like, "I don't believe in participation trophies. I believe in winners and everyone else." And he meant it. He'd fired a marketing executive in front of 40 employees for using the word maybe in a pitch meeting. He tipped exactly 15%. Not a penny more because, in his own words, excellence is the baseline, not a bonus. People who worked for him didn't call him ambitious. They called him something else behind closed doors. Something that doesn't get printed in Forbes. That morning, he was in an unusually good mood because the papers on the river acquisition had just cleared, and in 6 weeks he'd be breaking ground on Wexford Riverfront, a project that would, according to his own press release, redefine the Chicago skyline for the next century. He was walking toward the tower entrance with his phone pressed to his ear, mid-sentence with his chief financial officer, when he nearly tripped over a pair of legs stretched across the sidewalk. The man they belonged to was sitting against the base of a lamppost, wrapped in a faded green army jacket that had seen better decades, a cardboard sign propped against a duffel bag beside him. He looked to be somewhere in his 60s, maybe older, hard to tell under the layers and the gray stubble and the weathered lines carved into his face by what looked like years of sleeping outside. His eyes, though, if you'd stopped to actually look at them, were sharp, clear, almost amused. Like he was watching a play he'd already seen 100 times and already knew how it ended. Marcus stumbled, caught himself against the lamppost, and the phone nearly flew out of his hand. For 1/2 of 1 second, the entire sidewalk seemed to hold its breath, because everyone within 20 feet had just watched Marcus Wexford, a man whose face was on a billboard 4 blocks away, almost eat concrete because of a homeless man's legs, and Marcus did not handle it with grace. "Are you kidding me?" he snapped, loud enough that heads turned. "Move. This isn't a shelter, it's a sidewalk." "My sidewalk, actually. I own the building right there." He jabbed a finger at the tower behind him. The old man looked up slowly, unbothered, and there was something in the way he did it, unhurried, almost patient, that made a few people nearby actually stop walking. "Didn't mean to trip you," he said, voice low and rough but steady. "Have a good morning." That should have been the end of it. A normal person, even an irritated one, walks away at that point. But Marcus Wexford had an audience now. Phones were already coming up, and there is a very specific kind of arrogance that gets worse, not better, when it senses eyes on it. "A good morning," Marcus repeated, laughing without any warmth in it at all. You want to know what a good morning looks like? A good morning is closing a 40-acre deal before breakfast. A good morning is not smelling like you slept in a dumpster behind a Popeyes. A few nervous laughs came from somewhere in the crowd. The kind of laughs people give when they're uncomfortable but don't want to be the one who isn't laughing. Marcus reached into his coat, pulled out his money clip, thick with hundreds, peeled off a $1 bill, and tossed it onto the sidewalk in front of the man, not into his hands, onto the ground, the way you'd flick a coin at a fountain. "Here," he said. "Buy yourself some self-respect. Won't cost much. Looks like you haven't got any left to spare." The old man didn't move for the dollar. He just looked at it lying there on the concrete and then back up at Marcus. And for one strange moment, his expression wasn't hurt, or angry, or humiliated the way you'd expect. It was something closer to curiosity. Like a scientist noting down a result he'd been expecting. Somebody in the crowd was filming. Of course somebody was filming. This was 2026. Somebody is always filming. "You should be thanking me," Marcus went on, warming up now, playing to the small crowd that had gathered, the way certain men do when they mistake silence for admiration. "People like you are why this city looks the way it does. I'm out here building the future, towers, jobs, tax revenue, and you're out here taking up space on a sidewalk I paid for the concrete under." He crouched down slightly, getting into the man's eye line, and something ugly slid into his voice. "You know what the difference is between you and me? I got up. Every single day of my life I got up and I did something. You just sat down and gave up. That's it. That's the whole secret. It's not that complicated." The old man reached out, slow and unhurried, and picked up the dollar bill off the ground. He folded it once, twice, and tucked it into the front pocket of his jacket. And then he looked up at Marcus with those clear, steady eyes, and he said something that not one single person in that crowd understood the weight of. Not that morning. "You're right," he said. "I did give something up. A long time ago." He paused. "But it wasn't hope, son. It was a company." Marcus barely registered the sentence. He was already turning, already straightening his jacket, already telling the small crowd, half joking, "Someone call the city. This is a health code violation," and walking into his building like he'd just won something. The video, 22 seconds of it, was already sitting on 3 different phones, about to make its way onto the internet before lunchtime. Marcus Wexford had no idea, not the faintest idea, that he had just spent 30 seconds mocking, insulting, and throwing a single crumpled dollar at the man, whose name was quietly listed as the majority, beneficial owner behind the very trust that held the ground, lease under the tower he'd just walked into. His name was Walter Bellamy, and 11 days later, Marcus Wexford's entire empire was going to come apart in his hands like wet paper. Now, to understand how a man in a torn army jacket, sleeping outside a building he technically controlled, ends up in that position in the first place, you have to go back 31 years, to a much younger, much different Walter Bellamy. In the early 1990s, Walter Bellamy was not a name anyone in Chicago recognized on the street. But in certain rooms, in certain boardrooms on LaSalle Street, it was a name that made people sit up straighter. Walter had started with almost nothing. The son of a steelworker from Gary, Indiana, who put himself through Northwestern on scholarships and night shifts. And by the time he was 30, he had built, from a single office above a dry cleaner, a company called Meridian Holdings. Meridian didn't build flashy towers. It didn't have its name in gold letters anywhere. It quietly, patiently, over 2 decades, bought up land, ground leases, utility easements, parking infrastructure, air rights over rail corridors, the unglamorous, invisible skeleton that an entire city's real estate gets built on top of, the kind of asset that never makes the cover of a business magazine because it's boring and because almost nobody outside, a very small circle of institutional lawyers even understands what it means to own it. By the time Walter Bellamy was 55, Meridian Holdings, through a web of trusts and holding companies deliberately built to be difficult to trace, controlled the ground leases beneath more than 60% of downtown Chicago's major commercial towers. Developers built the buildings. Developers put their names on them. But underneath almost every one of those buildings, Walter's company owned the actual dirt on 99-year leases that had been signed generations ago and quietly renewed, generation after generation, collecting ground rent that most tenants never even noticed on a balance sheet 3 layers removed from their own. He was, by any reasonable measure, worth billions. Nobody knew it because he'd structured it that way on purpose. And because he never once gave an interview, never appeared at a gala, never let a photographer within 100 feet of him. Walter Bellamy believed deeply and quietly that money should be invisible, that the moment you let people see how much you had, they stopped seeing you at all and started seeing only the number. Then, in 2009, Walter's wife, Eleanor, died of pancreatic cancer, 11 months after being diagnosed. They had one son, a boy named Peter, who at the time of his mother's death was 26 years old and, by his father's own private admission years later, already a stranger to him. Walter had spent 30 years building an empire, so his family would never know struggle. And in doing so, he had missed almost every school play, every birthday, every ordinary Tuesday dinner that actually makes a family a family. Peter grew up resenting the empty chair at the head of the table, more than he ever appreciated the empire that chair was busy building. 6 months after his mother's funeral, Peter Bellamy took a fatal overdose in an apartment his father's money had paid for, in a building his father's trust technically owned the ground under, and Walter Bellamy found out he had lost his entire family from a phone call while he was in the middle of closing a $300 million acquisition. He closed the deal anyway. He has said in the only interview he ever gave, decades later, and only to a small non-profit journal almost nobody read, that finishing that call instead of getting on a plane immediately was the single greatest failure of his life, worse than any business mistake he ever made, and that it took him years to even be able to say that sentence out loud without his voice breaking. After that, Walter Bellamy essentially disappeared. He didn't sell Meridian Holdings. He didn't liquidate it. He restructured the entire company into an irrevocable trust, appointed a small, fiercely loyal legal and management team. He trusted with his life to run the day-to-day operations, exactly as he'd built it, quietly, invisibly, collecting ground rents and reinvesting steadily, and he walked away from the world he'd built. He gave away the vast majority of his personal, liquid fortune to causes he never publicized: addiction treatment centers, funds for families of overdose victims, scholarships given out, anonymously to kids from steel towns, just like the one he grew up in. And then he did something almost nobody in his position has ever done. He chose deliberately to live without any of it. He wasn't insane. He wasn't destitute by accident. Walter Bellamy chose to spend his final years the way he did because, in his own words to that one journal, "I built a life around being untouchable, and it cost me the only two people, whoever made me feel like a person instead of a balance sheet. I wanted, before I died, to know again what it felt like to be looked at and seen as nothing. Because for 30 years, that's exactly how I looked at everyone else." He kept a single small apartment, paid for quietly through the trust, where he showered and slept perhaps 2 nights a week. The rest of the time, he lived exactly as the world saw him that Tuesday morning outside the Wexford Tower. On the sidewalks of the city, he quietly still owned the bones of watching, unnoticed, invisible, exactly the way he had once wished the world would leave him, alone when he was busy building all of it. He wasn't friendless. Far from it. There was a small, tight circle of people who knew exactly who Walter Bellamy was and exactly where to find him. Chief among them, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney named Diane Okafor, who had been Meridian's general counsel for 18 years and who checked in on Walter in person every single week, rain or shine, bringing him coffee and, more importantly, bringing him updates. And it was Diane Okafor who, less than 4 hours after that 22-second video hit the internet, sat down across from Walter on a park bench 2 blocks from the tower with her laptop open and her jaw set in a way he'd learned over 18 years meant trouble for somebody. "You've seen this," she said, turning the laptop toward him. Walter watched the video once, all the way through, his expression unreadable. Marcus Wexford's voice, tinny through the laptop speaker. "You just sat down and gave up, that's it. That's the whole secret." "I saw it happen in person," Walter said dryly. "Didn't need the replay. It's at 2 million views, Walter. It's still climbing. Someone's already dug up his name, his company, the whole riverfront project. People are furious. There's a hashtag." She paused. "Do you know who he is?" "Marcus Wexford?" "I know exactly who he is," Walter said. And for the first time in the conversation, something shifted behind his eyes. Something old and tired and sharp all at once. He's the man who's 4 weeks from closing his construction, financing and breaking ground on that river project. And the ground he's about to break, Diane, the actual dirt under those 40 acres, sits on a 99-year lease that was assigned to Meridian Holdings by the original developer's estate back in 1994. It renews automatically every year, unless we choose not to renew it. It has one clause in it that nobody at Wexford Capital's legal team apparently bothered to actually read carefully, because it's buried on page 211 of a lease, document nobody reads anymore. He almost smiled. A morality clause. Ground lease terminable, at the lessor's sole discretion. In the event of conduct by the lessee, its officers or its principal representatives, that constitutes public and demonstrable moral turpitude, likely to bring material reputational harm to the property or its surrounding community. I wrote that clause myself 30 years ago for an entirely different reason. Never once used it. Diane sat back slowly. You're telling me you own the ground under his entire flagship project? I'm telling you Meridian owns the ground under 211 properties in this city, including that one, and including, as it happens, the tower he just walked into an hour ago and told a crowd of strangers he owns the concrete under. Walter's voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was an edge under it that Diane had only heard a handful of times in 18 years. He doesn't own the ground, Diane. He's never owned the ground. He's been paying Meridian ground rent on it every single quarter for the last 9 years, and I would bet everything I have left has no idea whose name is actually on that lease, because his own team structured the payments to go through 4 layers of shell entities, specifically so nobody would ever have to think about who's actually sitting at the bottom of it. Do you want to do something about it? Walter was quiet for a long moment, watching a pigeon work its way across the plaza, and when he finally spoke, his voice didn't sound angry. It sounded almost sad. For 15 years, Diane, I have watched this city from the ground up. From the exact angle every single person in a suit refuses to look. And in 15 years, I have met exactly 4 people who actually stopped to ask if I'd eaten. I've met hundreds who stepped over me like I was a crack in the sidewalk. And I never once did anything about any of it. Because that wasn't the point. I wasn't out here to catch people failing a test. I was out here because I earned every ounce of that invisibility. He tapped the laptop screen, where the frozen frame showed Marcus mid-sneer. Dollar bill falling through the air. But that man didn't just walk past me, Diane. He crouched down. He got in my face. He filmed himself in front of a crowd, telling a 68-year-old man that giving up is a choice. While he stands on land he's never once paid a fair price for and never once earned in the way he thinks he did. That's not indifference. That's cruelty as a personality trait. And cruelty like that, when it's dressed up in a $4 billion suit and given a stage, doesn't stay contained to one sidewalk. It becomes a management style. It becomes company culture. It trickles down into how he treats every single employee, every contractor, every small business he ever leans on. He closed the laptop gently. So yes, I want to do something about it. Not because he tripped over my legs. Because of what he did after. What Walter Bellamy did next was not loud. It was not a lawsuit, not a press conference, not a public confrontation. It was, in fact, almost exactly as quiet as everything else Meridian Holdings had ever done in 30 years of existence. And that quietness is precisely what made it so devastating. Over the following 11 days, 4 things happened in sequence. Each one small enough on its own to look like ordinary corporate friction, and each one landing on Marcus, Wexford's desk like a slow-motion collapse. He didn't see coming until it was standing directly on top of him. The first thing was a letter. On day 2, Wexford Capital's general counsel received formal written notice from Meridian Holdings' legal department that, pursuant to Section 14.3 of the ground lease agreement dated March of 1994, as amended and assigned, Meridian was exercising its contractual right to conduct a full compliance review of the lessee's standing under the morality and reputational conduct clause, triggered by, and the letter cited it by name, a viral video from October 14th depicting conduct by the lessee's chief executive officer. The letter was polite, bloodlessly professional, and it required, within 10 business days, a formal written response addressing the matter, or the lease would be flagged for potential Non-renewal review at Meridian's discretion. Marcus's general counsel, a woman named Priya Chandrasekaran, who had been trying for 2 years to get someone at the executive level to actually read their own ground leases in full, walked into Marcus's office with the letter and watched the color drain out of his face as she explained, patiently, that Wexford Capital did not, in fact, own the land beneath either the Wexford Tower or the 40 acres slated for the riverfront project. They owned 99-year leaseholds, both controlled by the same obscure entity, and buried in both contracts was a single clause that gave that entity the right to walk away from the deal entirely if the lessee's conduct crossed a certain line. Nobody at Wexford Capital reads Section 14 of a ground lease, Marcus said half to himself, staring at the letter. Nobody. That's boilerplate. That's page 200 nonsense nobody's touched since Reagan. Somebody wrote it, sir, Priya said carefully, and somebody just decided to use it. The second thing happened on day 5, and this one hit harder because it hit the money. Wexford Capital's construction loan for the riverfront project, $420 million, syndicated across 3 regional banks, had a standard covenant requiring proof of unencumbered, uncontested site control before the first draw could be released. Meridian's compliance review letter, sitting quietly in the county, recorder's public filing system as a matter of procedural transparency, which Meridian was entirely within its rights to do, was picked up within 72 hours by exactly the kind of due diligence analysts that regional construction lenders employ specifically to find reasons to get nervous. The lead bank called an emergency call with Marcus's finance team. They wanted in writing confirmation that site control was not, in fact, contested. Marcus's team could not, in good conscience, provide that confirmation because it was, in fact, contested actively by the entity that held the lease. The loan draw was frozen pending resolution. $420 million gone quiet overnight on a project that had already spent $11 million in pre-construction, costs with ground not yet broken. The third thing happened on day 8. And it wasn't Meridian's doing it all, not directly. It was simply what happens when word starts to move through a small, tightly networked industry. 2 other developers who leased ground from Meridian elsewhere in the city, men who had built decades-long, quietly respectful relationships with the invisible landholder behind their own projects, started making calls. Not to help Marcus, to distance themselves from him, a joint venture partner on an unrelated hotel project in the Loop, spooked by the headlines and the frozen financing and a general counsel, who suddenly wasn't returning calls quickly enough, exercised an exit clause of his own and walked away from a deal that had taken 18 months to structure. Marcus Wexford, for the first time in his professional life, watched people who used to return his calls within the hour start taking 2, 3 days to get back to him, if they got back to him at all. And the fourth thing, the thing that finally broke through even Marcus's considerable capacity for denial, happened on day 10, when Priya Chandrasekaran finally did what she had apparently been trying to get someone to authorize her to do for 2 years. She pulled the full, unredacted chain of ownership behind the trust that held Meridian Holdings, going through every layer of the shell structure with a forensic corporate researcher, and came back into Marcus's office with a single sheet of paper and a look on her face, like she'd just seen a ghost. "I need you to sit down," she said. "I'm already sitting down, Priya. Sit down more." She slid the paper across the desk. A short chain of entities, 4 layers deep, ending in a name that meant absolutely nothing to Marcus Wexford, because it had been built, brilliantly, deliberately, over 3 decades, to mean nothing to anyone who didn't already know. Meridian Holdings Irrevocable Trust, Trustee of Record, Diana R. Okafor, Esquire. Grantor and sole beneficial founder, Walter J. Bellamy. "Who is Walter Bellamy?" Marcus said. And it wasn't really a question. It was the sound of a man trying to place a name he almost recognized. Priya had already done the research. She'd spent 4 hours the night before down a rabbit hole of old SEC filings, a single archived business journal article from the mid-90s, court records from a probate filing in 2010, that named a deceased son and referenced, without detail, Grantor's subsequent personal circumstances. She told him everything she'd found. The steelworker's son from Gary, who built an invisible real estate empire on the bones of downtown Chicago. The wife lost to cancer. The son lost to an overdose 6 months later. In an apartment his father's own trust had, by grim coincidence, held the ground lease under. The single interview, given once, decades ago, to a small non-profit journal, in which Bellamy said the thing that Priya read out loud to Marcus in a voice that had gone very quiet. "I want it before I die." To know again what it felt like to be looked at and seen as nothing. Because for 30 years, that's exactly how I looked at everyone else. Marcus sat perfectly still for a long moment. Then he opened his laptop, pulled up the video, the one he'd tried very hard not to watch again over the past 10 days. And he let it play, all 22 seconds of it. And this time he watched his own face instead of the old man's. He watched himself crouch down. He watched himself flick a single dollar bill onto the concrete like he was tossing scraps to something that wasn't quite human. And he heard again the old man's voice, the one he had barely registered 10 days earlier because he'd already been turning to walk away, already congratulating himself. "You're right. I did give something up. A long time ago. It wasn't hope, son. It was a company." "Oh my God," Marcus said quietly. "I insulted him on the sidewalk of a building he owns the ground under, and I told the internet a homeless man is homeless because he gave up. He built half the skyline I've spent my career trying to buy pieces of." He put his head in his hands. He wasn't struggling. He chose that, and I mocked him for it in front of a crowd. And I have absolutely no idea, none, what he was actually giving up watching that day. What happened over the next several weeks did not play out the way most people, watching from the outside, expected it to. There was no dramatic public smackdown, no viral follow-up video of an old man rising up to destroy a billionaire in front of the cameras. Walter Bellamy had spent 30 years building a life around never being seen. And he had no intention of stepping into a spotlight now, not even one this deserved. What actually happened was quieter, and in its own way, far more uncomfortable for Marcus Wexford than any public humiliation could have been. Diane Okafor requested a meeting, not with Marcus's lawyers, but with Marcus himself. Alone, no press, no publicist, no lawyers sitting between them running interference. It took place in a small, unremarkable conference room in Meridian's equally unremarkable offices, 3 floors above a dry cleaner, not far from where Walter had started 30 years earlier. Marcus arrived expecting Walter Bellamy. Instead, he found Diane, and a single folder on the table, and, sitting quietly in the corner of the room in the same faded green army jacket, not saying a word for the first 10 minutes, Walter himself. "I'm not going to terminate your lease," Walter said finally. When Diane finished laying out, in clinical detail, exactly how thoroughly Meridian could have ended Wexford, Capital's business in this city if it had chosen to. "I want you to understand that clearly before we go any further. I built that clause 30 years ago, as protection against a very specific kind of person, and I have never once needed to use it. Not once in 3 decades. I'm not going to be the reason 400 people lose their jobs on a construction project, or the reason 3 regional banks eat a loss they didn't deserve. That's not justice. That's just a different kind of cruelty. And I've had enough of watching cruelty win by now to know I don't want to add to the pile." Marcus, to his credit, didn't try to explain himself. Didn't reach for an apology dressed up as a defense, the way men in his position almost always do. He sat there, silent, waiting. The way a man waits when he genuinely doesn't know if he's about to be forgiven or destroyed and has finally realized he doesn't get to control which one it is. "But I'm going to ask you for something," Walter continued. "Something that's going to cost you a great deal more than money. Because money, in my experience, is the cheapest thing a man like you has ever had to give up." He nodded to Diane, who slid the folder across the table. Inside it was a proposal drafted by Meridian's legal team, restructuring 12% of Wexford Capital's annual profits, guaranteed contractually binding, tied directly into the ground lease terms themselves, into a fund, not a charity gala fund with Marcus's name over the door, a working, operational trust that would build and staff permanent supportive housing and addiction recovery services across the city, administered independently, with Marcus Wexford's name appearing nowhere on a single building, a single press release, a single plaque. "You're going to build housing for the people you spent your career walking past," Walter said. and you're never going to get to tell anyone that you did it. No press release. No tax write-off photo op. No naming rights. You did this in public, Marcus, in front of a crowd with a camera pointed at you. You're going to undo it in private for the rest of your career with nobody watching at all. And every quarter, for as long as that lease exists, you're going to personally, physically walk the sites this fund is building. And you're going to talk to the people living there, not a foundation director, not a PR consultant standing next to you for a photo. You. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. And if I refuse, then I terminate the lease on all 211 properties, effective on the earliest date the contracts allow, and I let your bankers, your partners, and your board watch what happens to a real estate empire that discovers, all at once, that it never actually owned the ground it was built on. Walter's voice never rose. It didn't need to. I'd rather not do that. I meant what I told Diane 11 days ago. I'm not out here trying to catch people failing a test. But you failed it in front of 100 strangers and a camera. Son, and pretending it didn't happen isn't an option anymore. Not for you? Marcus signed the agreement 3 days later. What happened after that is, frankly, the part most stories like this one never bother to tell you, because it isn't dramatic, and it doesn't make for a satisfying viral clip. Marcus Wexford did not become a different man overnight. He did not suddenly appear on magazine covers as a reformed philanthropist, because the entire arrangement had been built, specifically to prevent exactly that kind of performance. What he did do, quietly, 4 times a year, every year, for the next several years, was walk through supportive housing units his own money had built and his own name would never be attached to, and sit down and talk to people who had absolutely no idea that the man across from them was the same billionaire who had once flicked a dollar bill onto a sidewalk. The first few visits, by his own later admission, were agonizing, performative, awkward, a man going through motions he resented. By the 3rd year, something had actually shifted quietly, the way real change almost always does, without anyone announcing it, without a headline, and somewhere, on a bench 2 blocks from a 60-story tower with somebody else's name, bolted in gold letters to the top of it, there's still a folded dollar bill, tucked away in an evidence box in Diane Okafor's office. The one thing she kept because Walter asked her to, as a reminder that the cheapest thing anybody can ever hand you is money, thrown at your feet, and the most expensive thing anybody can ever take from you is the 15 seconds it would have cost them to actually look you in the eye first. If this story hit you the way it hit me writing it, you already know what to do. Hit that subscribe button, because we've got dozens more stories exactly like this one waiting for you. Real people, real reversals. The kind of justice that doesn't come with fireworks, but hits 10 times harder because of it. Drop a comment and tell me the exact moment in this story that got you. The dollar bill, the letter, the reveal, whatever it was, I read every single one. And if you know somebody who needs a reminder that you never really know who you're standing next to, share this with them right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.